Wow, awesome. So you're going to stay here, and you guys aren't going to go see the concert tonight, right? We'll just be designing bosses all night long if you'll hang with us. Yeah. So how's your Blizzcon? If you're a little louder, we'll just do an extra day of Blizzcon. What do you say? Okay, I'll run that past executive management, so you can pull that off. Anyway, I really appreciate you coming and joining us. This is a big experiment for us because we've never done this. We've had a lot of people ask us, gee, what does a designer do? How do you guys put together bosses for these encounters? And so we wanted to share with you kind of a peek behind the curtains while we're going to do this live. So hopefully you've already gone down to play at our demo area. If you haven't, you should. We've got 2 great dungeons down there, but we've got 8 more to do. So tonight, we're going to be designing a boss that will appear in Battle for Azeroth. So, yeah. So I'm your moderator, John Haidt, so you're not going to hear any ideas from me. So, but I want to introduce some of the rest of the folks here. Ken Huang is actually going to be designing the boss. So it's his job. It's his job to implement this boss. He knows nothing about what we're about to talk about, so this is all going to happen. And Blizzard does everything in kind of a consensus fashion. We know that some of the best ideas don't come from a single individual, but from groups. So Ken's brought along some of his fellow designers to help out, come up with some cool ideas, and brainstorm the boss that we're going to do. So Morgan Day, Scott Gordon, Candace Thomas, Johnny Cash, and this guy, reaching out to community is super important for us in tuning our bosses, getting good feedback, and so we've invited Ted Sloot Baczynski to join us tonight. Ted recently did shoutcasting for us at our Mythic Dungeon Invitational. We loved what he did, so we wanted his input tonight. All right, so Morgan, tell us about dungeon creation. How's it go?
All right, so today we're here to brainstorm a dungeon boss. But before we get into that, we wanted to take a couple minutes to provide you guys with some context and give you a look behind the scenes as to what our process looks like and how we got to where we are today. So the first thing we have to do when we're creating a new dungeon is we have the pre-production meeting. This is a pretty small meeting where we just have a couple of people where we try to establish a few things. Things like, what's the setting of this location? Is this a haunted manor on the top of the hill like our dungeon in VOstFR? Or is this like what we're talking about today, where it's more of an exterior space where you walk across a cliff face? Additionally, we have to talk about things like, what's the story, right? What's my motivation? Why are we coming in here? What was the purpose of this place before we showed up? And most importantly, for today, what is the boss list, right? What are we going in there to punch? Coming out of that meeting, we always know exactly who the end boss is going to be, but we often have to figure out some of the supporting cast later on. But really, the goal of that meeting is to come out of it with enough information to create a 2D layout. After we've iterated on that layout a little bit, we're ready to have what we call the art kickoff meeting. This is where we get all of the stakeholders who are going to be building and creating and bringing this dungeon to life into a room, and we have a bit of a brainstorm. I call it a brain dump, really. We just kind of talk about all the information that's come up to that point. And we do a lot of brainstorming in there, too, to discuss, like, what's the purpose of this room? What is in this area? What would this boss be in? After we have that meeting, we're ready to go into full-blown production at that point. A few weeks later, we should have a 3D blockout that we can put into the game and actually start running around in and placing creatures and bosses. And at that point, we're ready to get the rest of the team, the encounter team up here involved, and have a similar meeting where we discuss the ecology of the dungeon and the bosses in there. We're not ready for brainstorming at that point for the mechanics and abilities, but really we're just talking about, like, what are the actual bosses, right? What is this thing that I'm punching? Is it a big sea creature, or what is it? We really want this group to be geeked out about what we're building, so we often kick around ideas in there, because at the end of the day, these are the guys that have to implement these bosses, like Ken is implementing the one that we're going to be talking about today. So that brings us to where we are today, where we're ready to do brainstorming, and to help us out with that, I brought Mr. Johnny Cash, who is the quest designer on the zone where our dungeon takes place, Stormsong Valley. So Johnny, why don't you tell us a little bit about the zone?
Sure, thanks, Morgan. So I'm a quest designer, like Morgan said, and so something you might be wondering is, hey, what's a quest designer doing on a panel full of encounter designers to make a dungeon boss? I'm usually more responsible for the outdoor content that, it takes place in Stormsong Valley proper. Well, they bring me into the meeting to provide the story context for what we're building. So anytime we're building any dungeon boss or raid boss or anything like that, we're going to bring in a quest designer to give us the context of the zone that this instance takes place in and what happens there, as well as the story of the dungeon itself, so that when we actually get to creating the boss, we're making really informed decisions, and we're making a boss that really sells the theme and story of the area it takes place in. So let's talk a bit about Stormsong Valley. You might remember from the Wow What's Next panel that Stormsong Valley is the northernmost region of Kul Tiras, so it's one of our alliance zones for the expansion. In my opinion, it's also the prettiest zone in the expansion, which is kind of nice. So what's in Stormsong Valley? Stormsong Valley is kind of this idyllic workplace for the Kul Tirans. In Stormsong Valley, you see a lot of tradesmen, farmers, beekeepers, and most importantly of all, shipwrights. Kul Tiran culture is based heavily around their navy and their fishermen and sea life. And Stormsong Valley is where the lion's share of ships in Kul Tiras are made. So you might be wondering, the Alliance is probably pretty interested in this, right? With the battle for Azeroth looming and the different continents divided by a vast ocean. But why exactly are we interested in the Kul Tiran Navy? They have ships, but so do we, right? We have a shipyard in Stormwind. We've built ships over the years, so why do we want Stormsongs? Well, the Stormsong Valley is home to something that makes Kul Tiran ships very different than the ships we've seen before in Warcraft. House Stormsong is the dominant military power in the valley, and they have a secretive group of powerful casters known as Sea Priests. Now, Sea Priests are something that we've never seen before in Warcraft. They actually have magical dominion over the ocean. So they're controlling the water, they're controlling the storms, they're controlling the wind. And what they do to every single ship that's created in Kul Tiras, regardless of where it's made, they all pass through their stronghold to be blessed by the Sea Priests. And that magical, the runic binding on every single vessel is what makes them unlike anything we've ever seen in Warcraft before. So, their stronghold is the Shrine of the Storm, and that is also where our dungeon takes place today. Now, this is a really cool concept piece, and you can actually see it in-game today. So we're coming really far along, making a lot of really great progress on bringing this space to life so that we can fill it with bosses. Now, I won't spoil the story for the zone, but know this. Stormsong Valley is a very idyllic land, but there's dark secrets and dark forces at play beneath its rolling hills. And you will uncover that as you play through the zone's content, inevitably leading you into the Shrine of the Storm to do our dungeon experience for today. And so, let's get to the boss, right? That's what we're all here for. Our boss is an embodiment of the sea's fury itself, an enormous water elemental, bigger than any we've ever encountered before, and brimming with the very power that the Sea Priests have at their disposal. And we'll get to his abilities in just a minute. But first, let's go to Scott to talk about the space this guy is in and how we actually put the dungeon layout together.
Thanks, Johnny. As Morgan said earlier, one of the very first things we do when designing a dungeon is create a layout for it. This is it's like a blueprint for the zone. Because we draw this out on paper and it's a 2D image, we're able to iterate on it very quickly. We can change the layout of the rooms. We can decide if there are multiple floors. Do we start in a hallway or a chapel or things like that? Once we've figured all this out, we can give this blueprint to the artists and designers, and they have something to start on when they're building the zone. In the case of the dungeon we're talking about today, Shrine of the Storms, there's this really cool concept piece that one of our concept artists made. And when we saw this, we were immediately inspired, and we got really excited and geeked up about going along the cliffs underneath the Kraken and walking across the bridge and actually seeing the dungeon take place around it. So with that in mind, we created this layout that we're going to show you right now. So in this layout, we start in the bottom of the zone along a sea bluff or a cliff, and we walk underneath the Kraken motif up to the area where we're going to fight the first boss. That's the boss we're going to talk about today, and we're going to design. Once players defeat this boss, they can walk across the bridge, and they get a better view of the motif from the front, and they'll face a second boss in an area where they have tons of fountains, and it's where they cleanse themselves before entering the chapel. Finally, they'll walk across the bridge underneath the Kraken tentacles that are wrapped around the bridge itself, and you enter their actual cathedral where they perform these rituals on these ships. So with that in mind, we can start talking about the boss.
So 2 things real quick before we start brainstorming the boss. I want to share with you guys our only rule during our brainstorms, which is that there are no bad ideas in a brainstorm. This is a safe place to just fling ideas at the wall, see what sticks, see what people like. One of the most common phrases that we hear in these brainstorming meetings, you might even hear today, Ted, feel free to steal this one, is, so this is a really bad idea, but, and then they throw out usually a really bad idea. It's usually not good. But the reason we do that and the value in that is that it might inspire somebody else to come up with something really cool, or somebody else might take that idea and roll with it. Like we were saying, this is a super collaborative process. So you just want to throw everything out there. So the things that you hear us saying up there, we know that not all of it is great. That's why we're here. And last but not least, like we mentioned, we've never talked about this water elemental before. We don't know what he's going to do. This is all on the fly. This is all off the cuff. So with that said, let's start talking. What do we got?
So you said that this is summoned by the sea priest. Is he going to be, do we want him to be in the room when that happens? Do you want to see him like come out of the water in that epic reveal moment, or?
Oh, definitely. Up to us whether we want him to actually be in the room during the fight or not, doing kind of a background lead-up sort of thing, but definitely want to pay off that big moment of the head sea priest channeling all of his power and raising the ocean itself into our boss.
I think we kind of want to use the sea priest guy for later, so I want to keep the focus on the water elemental itself.
You
Okay.
can see him in the background, like maybe he's on the bridge, like the one that we have to cross after we beat the boss. Maybe he's back when he summoned it, and then he just pieces out, like
Oh,
fades
sure.
away
Like,
into the darkness.
Just like a reveal. So does that mean that the room is flooded if the water elemental is coming out of something? Like, doesn't have to be like at least like knee-deep water?
That's a good point. We should probably figure out the room, huh? We have this layout, but that doesn't mean, like, I mean, we had the picture earlier where we were like chest high on him. Does that mean we're playing against
Oof.
torso boss, or does
Yeah,
that mean we
then
can,
it's really hard to see like area denial on the ground.
then again, we can always change that. He's whatever we want him to be. Like, he could be in the middle of this platform. He could be hanging off the side of it. It's whatever we want. So.
I mean, you have the water source on the side, so you can summon him out of the water onto the platform. The size or his mobility, Immersius obviously comes to mind, a very iconic water elemental boss. But it seems to me like it's a pretty large platform there. It's something you can probably play with a lot in terms of where the boss spawns. Maybe he is immobile, but maybe he can kind of go into the ground, out of the ground in different areas too.
So here's a bad idea. What if whenever he's in physical form and you can actually punch him in the watery face, there's no water in the room, but whenever he submerges, he just like floods the room and now you're like swimming or something. Or like there's like a different threat that comes out, like sharks or piranhas or the squid or something can finally like come out of the ocean.
Ken knows a thing or two about that.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Something that's cool about a water elemental like this is it can have a lot of different shapes. Like it actually could turn into a wave that washes over the platform, and it could play into what Ted was talking about of like maybe he starts out off the cliffside. He is so large that you're fighting him from the waist up, but then he turns into a wave and crashes onto the play space, and now maybe there's more than one of him. Or
The way I see it from kind of the player fantasy going in there is that this guy's trying to defend this temple, trying to defend this dungeon, make sure nobody gets through that door and see kind of what's going on. And you guys have this idea where it's on the cliff side, so it makes sense to me to have a water elemental boss that's literally trying to wash you off the side of the cliff. So maybe there's a kind of wave thing you guys can do where if players don't move out of the way and they're going off the side of the cliff.
No, that's totally cool. We've done that in the past in like the Alakir fight. It was a big elemental guy on a platform, and if you got pushed off, it wasn't game over for you. You didn't necessarily die. We just gave you a very flashy return back to the platform that just so happened to take you out of the game for like 12 seconds as like a punishment, but not necessarily game over. That's totally something we can do here.
a dolphin
the
could rescue you.
Huh?
A dolphin could rescue you.
Heck yeah,
What was-
flying dolphins.
What was the Shedham and Burial
Yeah.
boss? He was like trying to pull you off the platform though. This guy could be like splashing you with water, trying to blast you off of it though, like just
Yeah.
the inverse of it. But it's kind of what you would expect a water elemental to do.
Yeah, and so I guess another big question is most of our water elemental bosses that look like this have been sessile, which means they can't move. Is that a direction we want to go here? Do we want him to just like submerge and show up somewhere else like Raiden, or do we want him to actually be mobile if the room is flooded with water? Like, can we get like a cool like evocative anime of him walking around the water,
just scooting.
or just scooting around?
I think it could be cool. Like, I really like Ted's idea about flooding the room and doing the water thing. You could almost imagine an A/B alternating sort of thing of he's against the cliff, he's very large, he's very imposing, and when the area is covered in water, now he has that kind of, it's his element, so to speak, right? And he can actually move around and come after you. Maybe he's a wave, maybe it's his model, he scales down some. There's lots of options there.
I think we should try to avoid the waist up boss for this one. Usually when we do that, it's like, when you think of just scale, right?
Right.
If you think of bosses that are that size in a dungeon, you think of Helya, you think of Wrath of Ajara, like those are always the end boss. Because if we start with a boss that's this big, we're gonna be punching like the pinky toe of our last boss if we wanna make it not feel less epic for the last boss. So I think with this guy, we wanna go something not waist up. Maybe it is a mobile version, like if we actually got like, I'd have to think about what animations Immersius has, but like he looks like the Warcraft 3 water elemental, right? Who's just like kind of scoots around.
Yeah, scooting, that's a good word for it. What if, so do we want it to just be this one elemental, or the cool thing about water is that it can just sort of disperse and it can become whatever it wants to. We want to do the thing where like it splits into 2 and then you can like cleave it, and then it splits into 4, and then you can start AoEing it and go crazy.
Kind of like how Tectus ran.
Yeah.
Was that Tectus?
Well, Tectus would you'd get him down and he'd split into 2 guys.
Yeah,
That sort
he
of thing.
like kept duplicating. That was cool. And the mechanics were even duplicating also. That'd be pretty sweet.
That could be part of the AB phase structure, or that could be like a phase C, like a bonus phase where you don't necessarily get a damage buff, but just by virtue of being able to AoE, you're doing more damage to him before he like reconvenes in some kind of way.
So you just dropped a few buzzwords there in terms of phase structure. You want to explain that a little bit?
Sure. So like Johnny was saying, there's like an A-B phase structure, which means that he'll do one thing. He'll have like one set of abilities. He'll have one set, like he'll be in his one form, and then he'll shift over to phase B, but then eventually return back to phase A, and then it'll just keep cycling through the fight. And then like a phase C might be like you go through phase A and phase B enough, and then he gets low health, and then he stops going through phase A and B, and then you get a bonus phase C or something like that.
I was just actually thinking about the Tectus idea plus the like pushing you off idea. It'd be kind of neat too, because with one, it would be like push you at like 3 yards a second. But as you get more and more of them, the force, like more of them are pushing us back would be kind of cool. Or maybe just like only one person is pushed at the start, and then towards the end, if there's 3 of them or 4 of them by then, like all of us are getting pushed back by then.
I do really like how that, playing off of Tectus and playing off of some of those other elemental bosses we've done before, and I think paying that minor homage to Immersius, right, with the splitting and the iconic thing that he did, I think the thing I really like is it's really chasing after that fantasy of fighting the ocean, right? We've all been kids and tried to build a sandcastle on the beach. This will never fall down. I spent all day on it, and then inevitably it does, right? That keeping the boss's abilities potentially on the simpler side, but them stacking and multiplying against you, and that feeling of being, that race to bring him down before he can multiply enough to bring you down. There's something really cool about that, about capturing that fantasy.
It's also not splitting into lots of little droplets that reform.
Right, it gives it a different flavor than what we've seen before, but it is consistent.
And it doesn't have to be droplets. It could just be smaller versions of himself. He could just be like he's everywhere. He's like a reflection of the ocean. He's in all places at all times. And maybe like you DPS one down and it bursts into water, and then something drops its heart, or who knows, its shackles. Does it have like the classic water elemental bindings of the? Oh, it does. Ooh,
Well,
and
he was summoned,
tentacles.
right? So
I think, I think what's really unique about this guy is he has those kind of Cthulhu chinticles, as you call them, going on. So there's definitely this kind of, from a player side feeling, whatever we know, that there's this kind of, void, old, gaudy kind of presence going on here because of just the way he's structured. And then one of the key pieces we saw earlier where there was that just tiny person on the cliffside fending. It almost even looked like they were just attacking him, ready to stab him with those chin things.
Yeah, so I can imagine that he actually like physically punches the tank. He's not like a caster that's water bolting. He's just like, ugh.
that's interesting. What if going with the chinticles and the idea of like the shadow as well as water idea, right?
Yeah.
Like, because we've just been focusing on water. Ted brings up a good point, which is we potentially could play off the shadow kit if we're saying that this guy is some form of corruption or something, but like maybe he's using both water and shadow, right? But then as he's splitting, potentially the water is getting more powerful and the shadow, like something's getting diluted there, right? It's probably not the water because he's just splitting, but maybe the shadow ability that he's using is getting weaker as the water ability is getting stronger or something like that.
Interesting. Or also riffing off of that, what if what you're actually killing is like the corruption, and there's like a dark something in some of the water elementals, and you have to hack through the elementals to find out whether or not they have that corrupted core, or whether they have like that magic nugget or whatever it is that the priest was like, take this.
Like the XT heart just falls
Yeah,
out.
like
Well, the shackles that are on the water elemental that could be the source of its corruption. in
yeah,
this
that
case.
could be kind of cool.
You wouldn't want to actually punch bracers, but the idea would be like to break the crystal that's in the side of his bracer.
Yeah, maybe that like dispels the illusion or whatever it is that's making the water elemental what it is.
Maybe he can't reform once it's destroyed, and so like maybe you're killing him over and over and over again, but it's destroying the bracers that ultimately beats the fight.
It's like a shell game where there's just infinite ones of them spawning, and you have to keep finding the one that has the bracers on it to kill the one with the bracers, and you're just getting like overwhelmed, and it's splitting, and you don't know what to do. And then all of a sudden they just wash you off the platform.
So the damage you put into the non-bracers one, they just kind of fall down into puddles of water and come back into the
Yeah, that's awesome. Or like when you kill them, they deal splash damage.
No.
Don't encourage her.
I got a million of them. I got wave event, I got
So
soak
funny.
mechanic, I got this all day.
So punny.
Just don't talk about soap.
And so if we did want to do a C phase, kind of riffing off that idea of finding the corruption, that might be a little bit long for a first boss, but maybe once you do find that source of corruption, right, it reveals its true form or envelops it completely in shadow or something like that, and you get that last burn phase of a void elemental sort of thing or a void walker sort of thing. There could be something cool there.
I don't know if we need to do A, B, and C for the first boss. I think just doing the A split apart B thing is kind of cool for this guy.
So would there be some kind of, I know it's really satisfying for players a lot of the time, and we had a few instances in Seed of Triumvirate now where there's a kind of big damage intake phase, 200% increased damage, or you get some kind of buff or something. It's usually pretty satisfying, especially for the DPS to have that kind of thing. So I feel like there might be room on this fight to do something with the water theme and, I don't know, air bubbles, whatever it may
Oh,
be, to have that kind
totally.
of thing.
You could do the kind of thing where you have to pace your DPS, because if you burst one of the elemental adds, then it does do AoE splash damage, as it were. And so if you kill
Stop
too
it.
many at once, then you just wipe, that. Splash.
So I missed a part. We're not doing Tectus 1 to 2, 2 to 4. There's like
Could be anything.
tons of little lads.
I think that still works. The Tectus 1 to 2, 2 to 4, it's just one of them keeps the bracers.
Or sometimes two of them have the bracers, or you just have to seek them out, and there's like waves coming at you. It's like hard to see. You could even give them that screen effect, like whenever you're invisible. Sometimes like maybe you're drowning or something that's hard for you to see. Like not all the time, obviously, but he afflicts you with Curse of the Ocean, drowning or something.
Maybe to riff off of the thing we were talking about earlier, the one with the bracers could be getting more and more like shadowed out basically, or voided out like you said. So at the
Yeah.
end, like maybe the chinticle thing, he's not that at first. He's just a good old water elemental. But then after he splits the first time, the one with the bracers gets more shadowed out because some of the water left and formed these little ads, and then he gets chinticles or something. And
It
maybe
really
there's a third version of him that. Is there a character artist? It's fine. There's a third version of him where like he becomes purple and more shadowed out, basically.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You could just change his color. It just gradually becomes more purple. That'd be pretty cool to see.
You can even do a cool.
I'm kind of curious. So you're starting with a piece of concept art. You're riffing off of that, but do your ideas cause you to go back to the drawing board and actually reinvent the boss a little bit? Like you talked about, hey, can we have a character artist change this boss a bit?
Yeah, often we're given a piece of concept like this to work with, which is fantastic. I don't think they've created this yet either, so when we do these brainstorms like this, oftentimes we can just come up with new or other ideas, and oftentimes at Blizzard, when you're geeked up enough about an idea, if you can sell someone on how cool this idea is, they're more than happy to make it for us. So in a case like this, if we're like, hey, as well as this guy. What if there was a purple guy? Because we have this really cool idea for the boss with all these mechanics will play into that. They're like, yeah, totally, we got you. So we try not to let that kind of production-related thing get into the brainstorming process too much, because we just want to come up with the best idea we can.
This isn't like mechanic heavy. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just mentioning, it'd be cool, like, we have the idea of him transforming into more and more evil versions. It'd be cool, since we're on the side of the river, of seeing the actual good water of him whenever you phase transition come out and like flow into the river and like kind of get away from him.
Yeah, or maybe he goes off the bluff's edge and he just becomes enormous or something like that while you're dealing with the little ones. Because I just had a thought of like, just kind of a cool visual moment. It's not like a neat mechanic, but like he has this anim where he like makes the water rise and like the orbs of water are coming out like globules or something, and he's just like, kind of like in Fantasia whenever Mickey's doing like the, or like a Hadouken, like a really get it out there, like, sorry.
So it sounds like this guy actually ends up being more of a Void Walker, right?
By the end, you mean?
So he starts as a water elemental and you're slowly siphoning him off to be a Void Walker at the end of the fight.
Sure.
Just visually, I'm trying to think what that would...
Sounds like that's, they both have the same cuff motif. They're kind of controlled by something.
Totally.
Is there a way we could make the shadow and water kind of work together in some way? Like to me, that would be the most interesting thing, is if the shadow, like, almost was like opposed to the water, or if they interacted in some way that made the mechanics more interesting.
It could be the kind of thing where if you touch bad water, you get debuffed by shadow or something, like you're impure or you're unclean in some kind of way. Is that part of the Sea Priest kit? Do they manipulate light and shadow, or like what? Are they just like nautical themed?
It's definitely leaning very much on the nautical theme. I think if they did some of the light shadow stuff, it wouldn't be completely inappropriate.
Okay.
But I think doubling down on the storm water theme makes a lot of sense, especially going into that later boss that Scott was talking about where they're like cleansing themselves. There's something cool about they have some way to get rid of the shadow, but I think they would get rid of it in some way that feels nautical.
Okay.
The thing you mentioned about the unclean debuff, you could have the like pools of clean water, and actually walking into them removes that.
Yeah.
But then you've created a pool of bad water, and maybe that's what animates it as a shadowy apparition or something like that. Like,
Sorry, unrelated, but I just had a random idea. There's a boat, and there's a channel, and there are boats. Would we be able to get them involved somehow? Like, or would that be worth discussing?
they're like shooting their cannons at you
I
as
don't know,
they drive
maybe,
by.
yeah.
Like on heroic mode, one just comes over and bombards you for no freaking reason
Exactly.
whatsoever. Just like, hey, F you.
Mythic mechanic, maybe? Bunch of cannonballs shooting on the side of the platform, get worse and worse, those kind of soft enrage style.
Tyrannical boats.
That could be cool.
So it's probably a good time for us to just sort of take stock of what you've heard so far. How much of this is kind of sticking with you? What do you want to roll with from this point, Ken?
I think some AB phase version of the fight works out pretty well here. One where he's the big water elemental with the bracers, and after you do some amount of damage or some mechanic to him, he'll break up into a couple different pieces. One of them is the real one with the bracers that you're fighting, and then after you maybe get his health low, they'll reform up into the big guy. Each time he'll reform up into the big guy, he'll get a little more shadowier than before. Maybe go back and forth a couple times before the fight ends.
What'd you think of Morgan's idea at the end there of rolling in the boat and the cannons?
I think if we were to use the boat, probably be for Heroic Plus. I just worry a little bit about diluting the theme of the guy with the boat.
So I'm kind of curious. And this sounds awesome. Sounds very ambitious. Where do you start to draw the line? Where do you say, okay, this is too much for a dungeon. This is the kind of stuff we might save for a raid?
So far what we have doesn't scare me that much. So one of the things that we always try to consider with dungeon bosses is just how much time players get to spend with them, right? So with a dungeon boss, we expect it to really only last like a couple minutes, like two plus-ish minutes. With a raid boss, we're talking about like many minutes, from 6 to on up. So we know that there's a lot more time to let mechanics as well as additional phases breathe. So we have often done like A/B bosses, like where we go from one phase to the next, back to the next, or even just, at 50% health, trigger the next thing, right? That's usually where we try to stop the complexity level for a dungeon boss. So this is pushing it, but I think we're okay.
We also don't want to overload you with mechanics. I think that the rule of 3 is a good number for game design, where you don't want to have someone have more than 3 things in their mind at once. Like, what is my objective? What am I dodging? What else could possibly play off of that? And that's about as far as you want to go for the casual not casual, but the 5-man, possibly pug group mechanic.
And when do you start incorporating, the different roles? Like, hey, what's the tank doing? What are the healers doing? What's melee? What's range doing?
I think that would be like what Ken does. So the way that we describe this sometimes is whenever they do the dungeon layout and they're trying to figure out who's in the dungeon, you write the 1-sentence version of what this boss is. And then when we sit down and we have this meeting, we come up with the 1-paragraph version of what the boss is. So we say okay, it's a water elemental, but also it splits into 3 and it's pushing you off the side. But then Ken would take everything that we're just sort of vomiting out on stage right now and then turn that into a 1-page design where he decides okay, now how is this meaningful to the tank, and how are we making sure we're doing enough damage to keep the healer engaged? We can come up with some cool ideas on how to kit that and how to theme that, but ultimately that would be up to Ken.
So he's boxed you in a little bit now. So you want to spend a little bit more time kind of working within that box?
So no boats.
No boats. Maybe heroic. There's life.
Maybe.
Maybe. It'll happen, maybe.
Heroic boats.
Cool. So we've got. So you're saying you think when the water splits off, they're going to reform, or is that just ads that we kill and then the water's gone and he's more corrupted now?
Potentially, it's just ads that you kill that come back in, form back into the main guy. We could even have it split more than once. The way I was thinking in my head is he's the normal water elemental. He'll split once, and then he'll be the evil version of the water elemental. So you only have A, B, A, then you're done.
Right.
So are you thinking that every time he splits, he comes back and he has less health, and that's how you know that you're progressing on the boss? Or when he turns into the shadow version, is he a new one with 100% health?
I think you just keep the same health bar the whole time.
Okay.
So when you get him down to, say, 50, he'll split into him and his buddy, essentially, or even more than one buddy. You kill them, he comes back at 50, or whatever damage you've done to him in the meantime.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting, because then that can be one of those things in Mythic Plus when you're really pushing those keystones. How many times he submerges can be what pushes you over the edge of killing this boss on time.
So what's the mechanic then to have to kill his buddies? Does he just go immune? Do they take double damage from the cleave? We never really decided, are they immobile or not?
I think we went for he's moving around. As to going immune, typically that doesn't really, or it's hard to make that feel good when players have to switch over because the main guy that you're watching the life bar of goes immune. It could even be something like the side guys just do the exact same abilities as the boss, so that's why you want to get rid of them, because they have much less health and they're presenting their own threats in some way.
Are you thinking the watery Hadoken, or are you gonna pass?
I'm okay with that.
The pushback thing?
Yeah.
Kind of cool.
It's pretty
He
cool.
could even do the thing we were talking about before, where he transforms into a wave, goes across the play space, and then comes back up as a water elemental. That way, when you've got 2 or 4 of them, it's threatening in its own way.
I'm curious. This guy, do you think that he talks? Do you think that he'd be smack talking to you the whole time, or is he just kind of this mindless, aberrant horror that's just I kill?
We've done both treatments of elementals before, but I personally kind of prefer it when we give them that voice, give them that personality. It can be kind of that raw, powerful, angry sort of vibe that we've seen with Tectis, right? Tectis isn't exactly going out to write a novel, or the Wrath of Ajara, or some of those other elemental bosses, right?
Sure.
But I do think it's cool to have him talk, and I think there's a cool opportunity there as he becomes more shadow, as he's revealing his true form, right? We can kind of have his voice modulate over time, so those sound lines that he's saying, or the abilities that he's doing, can take on some of that shadowy effect. If you think back to Yogg-Saron, right, when he's revealing his true form, spoilers, at the heart of Ulduar, right, that voice transition is a super awesome moment.
Would you say that the water elemental's voice is deep?
Yes.
We never have any puns in anything that we do in World of Warcraft, by the way.
It was a nice career for a while, so you guys fired Monday.
Morgan, I had an idea to keep the boats.
Oh, I'm in.
Just hear me out here. I like the boats. If players get washed off by the waves, right? I'm assuming it's the wave mechanic is actually what would knock players off.
Yeah.
They get brought back onto the platform by the boats. They get shot out of a cannon back.
Or someone fishes
Like
them
a,
up
like
out
a
of the water.
circus.
Yeah.
Like the Colterans are just like, hey, and then they shoot you in a cannon back onto the.
Yeah.
That could be a cool way to hit what is basically just a stun mechanic.
Right. And maybe fighting this guy, or facing that guardian is kind of their ultimate, their rights, right?
And
you can't enter their sanctum, and that's part of the story that we're trying to sell in the zone. Is this is a place where nobody goes except for sea priests, and so we could tie it into conquering that passing that as their test to enter their sanctum.
That's cool. Yeah, because we can't like just death touch you or kill you instantly for getting knocked off. It's a dungeon, first boss in the dungeon, no less. It should feel like a timeout. Like, here you go, sit in the corner, jump in the cannon, get back up. All right, you're back in the fight.
I mean, we can. We just be big jerks.
Right. You could
We'll
always
get
do the
feedback.
water spout, but you could also do a ship.
He could pick the boat up and throw it at you.
With his tentacles.
Going on that a little bit, I kind of like the idea of maybe like he leans forward and like slams his face down, grabs one person with his tentacles and like sort of swallows them inside his watery chest, and you have to save the guy by punching him out. And that's threatening in its own way because if he splits into multiple guys, then
Like he has
bad
these
times.
he has these two perfectly good hands, but he's just like, I'm gonna get you. I love it.
It's way creepier. Come on.
It's totally creepy.
Maybe he puts his hands down next to you and then bites you.
When you're saying putting his hands down, it just kind of, I don't want to like completely redesign the fight now, but because the bracers are kind of that soft spot or what he's enchanted, it's an opportunity for him to slam his hands down and maybe get a bit of extra damage in. He takes a damage multiplier on his bracers. And when he does that, his tentacles, because it's water and stuff, kind of can go in the ground, and those are your void zones that you avoid. Or you could turn it into a soak mechanic. We all love that. It's up to you. But
I knew it was going to happen.
so
Now
the
you're gonna
last
have to-
panel ever, apparently. But so there's just definitely an idea there with the tentacles, and I just like focusing on that because that art is amazing. It looks great, and they're just so obvious on his face, so menacing. So it'd be neat to see those in play somehow.
It could be the kind of thing where the tentacles, maybe they don't necessarily like he leans over and picks them up, but it's the kind of thing where like it's like a spiraling water looking thing, right? And they like spiral back down into if you're standing in water. I haven't decided. Have we decided if the room is like chest high, knee high? Is there any water in the room besides him?
I think it's just a solid like dry platform above the river itself.
Okay, because I was thinking like they could turn into friggin' chin tornadoes and like go down to the water and then like and, like
Chin
funnel you up
tornadoes.
out of the water and then just be like. It was just a thought.
Changing subjects, we haven't talked about Shadow at all.
Right.
We really like the tentacles, but if he's going to do Shadow stuff, we should probably figure out like what that is, right? I think something that Scott mentioned that was a really cool idea is if we're doing the like Hadoken, like push you off the platform, can we somehow put like shadow stuff on the ground? Maybe it snares you so that you can use it to not get pushed off, or it stuns you or something if you touch it, but you want to get stunned so you don't get pushed off, or something weird, or I don't
Like
know.
the Bone Maw fight in Shadow Moon Burial Grounds was kind of like he's trying to like suck you in like Kirby, and what you want to do is stand in the goo because the goo makes you sticky and then you don't get sucked in. Could be the opposite thing where there's like a shadow puddle on the ground and you're immobile or something like that. When he pushes you off, it's like, well, would you rather get pushed off or would you rather take some shadow damage? It's like let them
It
decide.
seems weird from a fantasy perspective for the player that you want to be standing in the evil shadow stuff. So instead of something that'll help you get pushed against the wave, maybe there are gaps in the wave that you could naturally dodge, but touching one of those puddles actually amplifies the wave pushing you. So it's a punishment rather than a savior. It just seems kind of weird that, evil shadow stuff, I should go stand in it.
Interesting. Do you imagine that one of his primary attacks that's just like doing damage to the raid would be shadow, or do you think that it would mostly be water?
I think a cool flavoring thing is like it could be water at the beginning, and then when he transforms, it turns into shadow.
That's cool.
To Ted's point, you could do something, since we got tentacles, you can get the water version, or shadowy version of like maybe something actually grabs you, like physically grabs you. That could be interesting. Like maybe it's even a big wind up, like Ted, you're gonna get pushed off the platform and you wanna go jump on something or get grabbed by something, one of the tentacles maybe, to not get knocked off, or I don't know, I'm just trying to wrap my head around what is the shadow part of the guy. Since we have lots of really strong themes and kit ideas for the water, what's the shadow?
Well, it kind of depends right now because I guess everyone's kind of on board for this wave mechanic pushing you off, but there's some disparity right now between, is it just going to be one big inevitable wave that goes through, or are there going to be several waves and you kind of have to Frogger your way through?
Yeah.
And I mean, you can maybe get hit by one, it'll set you back a bit, but ultimately there's maybe 2 or 3 layers that you have to dodge in order to get back to the platform or be safe.
I think splitting those up into 2 different abilities or mechanics is kind of the way to go here. One would be the waves that kind of go across and you dodge them or you take a bunch of damage, and another is kind of like a water jet that he channels on you that's shooting streams of water trying to push you towards the edge.
So would just him be shooting it, or when he splits, we'd have 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them?
Absolutely. You could have a bunch of them channeling on a bunch of different random people, pushing them towards the edge.
So it's like a bullet hell of waves where you're trying to dodge all the bullets, but then when he splits, there's even more of them, and it's your worst nightmare?
Yeah.
So would there be some inherent benefit to not killing those ads? Because I know when we think especially about Mythic Plus, it's all about there's some kind of risk reward and trying to be efficient, even if it's at the risk of perhaps wiping. So would there be some benefit to not having to kill the ads that he splits in, outside of saving some damage because you can funnel it directly into the boss? You know, the risk being, of course, the more there are, the more damage, the more people can get knocked off. But where's the benefit of not doing that? Or is there one? Should there be one?
Yeah, I agree. I'd have to think about it some more, but I want to lean towards the making killing the ads a bonus and really want to push that rather than let you just tunnel the boss and ignore everything else on the side.
You could do the thing where if you kill one of them, then that's like part of his health, right? So every one of them that you kill is like 5% off of his health, and he could just have an enormous amount of health. And like, I don't know, that maybe that doesn't feel good whenever you're punching him outside of that phase though. Like you're hitting his hit points by like 1% every 6 minutes.
What if the water is normally considered like pure, right? Like holy in a sense? And there's a mechanic I really liked from Il'gynoth where you're taking the ads to the edge of the actual boss's domain and you're killing them there, so location actually matters.
Yeah.
There could be something cool where when the ads die, they explode, right? A big splash of water. And particularly the more voided out the main boss is, the more damage he takes from this holy water. We kind of play off of that theme.
Oh, interesting. Like
maybe they always hurt him some, but like the closer they are to him, the more damage they're doing to him.
like the water is the antithesis to the shadow.
Right, which could tie in really cool to kind of the rest of the dungeon and sell that like there's a stark difference between those 2 things.
Just trying to figure out a way to sell that mechanically in the fight.
Right.
It's cool.
But, just something about that risk reward, right? Of like,
Yeah.
oh, if they're both doing waves, having them close together is bad, but taking advantage of the extra damage could be like on Mythic Plus, that could be a great time savings if you have the skill to do that.
Yeah. So the ads are mobile, right? The boss and the splitting and everything's mobile. They're not stationary.
Yeah, I imagine so.
So how, I mean, at the end of the day, then from a party perspective, what the tank just, I mean, the proximity issue here is kind of weird if they're mobile, because what does the tank do? Just picks all of them up and you just AoE them down on top of the boss.
Maybe.
It could be the kind of thing where the boss is mobile, but the ads just choose not to. Like maybe they're casters, or maybe they're just busy, like channeling waves, or perhaps Hadokening you a couple of times. And then when the boss is out, he's actually kind of dangerous, and maybe he can even walk around during that phase and punch you and be dangerous in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't.
Like
I
a
like that idea.
minefield of his own elementals, a minefield of his own spawn.
Where they're like they're all probably just channeling, right? But then if you have a blood DK or whatever, good for you. You can gore fiends them all together. So like if you're on your blood DK that day, yes, you can do that. But otherwise, they're probably just channeling on a bunch of people, which makes
Do
sense.
you try to work in any kind of class specifics? Like you just mentioned, if you had a DK there.
Yeah.
I mean, you go through each of the classes and think about, okay, what would happen if we, happen to have a hunter, or we had a demon hunter in here?
Yeah, with dungeons in particular, we're always we try to let everything fly and let as many things work as we can. Especially when we're coming up with things for dungeons, we try to find ways to let to have multiple solutions for a problem. So maybe there's like an ad that has a lot of health, but you could purge it to kill it, or if you don't have a purge, you can just punch it. But we often try to think of it from the perspective of like giving you multiple solutions to the problem where possible. A lot of that stuff also comes from feedback and play tests, and we're like, hey, that was really hard without X. Okay, well, how do we like incorporate some other way to solve that problem?
So I know people are going to ask, every one of us plays, we all have our favorite class, and yet you're the evil minds behind these encounters. How do you make sure that you aren't having some sort of favoritism towards your own classes?
The people sitting here will all play different things as well. So usually we're pretty good about saying like, hey, that's really mean to melee. I'm gonna give you feedback. That's really mean to melee. Please keep that in mind, even though we might not be that specific with a certain spec or something like that. So really we just lean on each other for that kind of feedback, and also the community, and where we get no lack of feedback in that regard.
And that's also the kind of thing that we can iron out. Like even if we don't somehow perfectly design the boss the first time, once we're playtesting it ourselves, we have the melees, we have the casters, we have all sorts of comps that we try. And if something doesn't work out, we're not afraid to just scrap it and start over.
So we're probably at the point where you need to make some decisions. I'd like to give Ted an opportunity to sort of voice in community perspective on what we've figured out here. So you want to kind of sum it up? Actually, all of you can kind of weigh in. Where are we? What is this boss all about?
Which ideas do you like the most?
Ken, you have to make it. What do you think?
I like the idea of that we originally hit on with the AB. He's got maybe 3 abilities or so in A phase. When you do get him down to 50, or maybe it's timed, we can do it by the energy bar and show his like water power underneath his health. He'll split into a couple dudes. Potentially just 2, but maybe more if we want to get crazy, maybe in Heroic Plus. But they all share his abilities, and when you damage them, it somehow damages him either by copying their damage onto him, or they explode and you have to bring him over, that sort of thing. After you deal with all of those, he'll reform back up into his main guy at whatever amount of health. You'll bring him down to 0 and win, hopefully.
Ideally.
Hopefully.
Okay, Ted, what do you think? Feedback?
I hate it. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, it sounds great. No, there's obviously there's always a bit of a disconnect between how you guys imagine things and what the players end up finding at home. It could be bugs, could be just something didn't come to image. I guess maybe a couple of concerns that stick out for this fight, and definitely feel free to chime in how you guys deal with these challenges, designing bosses in general, because so for this one, for instance, it's kind of a role-specific, more of a role-specific concern. Definitely, huge advantage here with bringing a multi-dot class. If we're gonna have a bunch of ads that are initially immobile. If you have a DK, great. What if you don't have a DK? Are we gonna be able to silence the mobs to bring them in or not? Is it just gonna turn into a cleave fest? And is there gonna be RNG for where the ads spawn? Third boss seat of Triumvirate comes to mind right now. There's definitely a lot of RNG and frustration sometimes in where those tentacles spawn. That really kind of makes it very unattractive, honestly, to bring melee. So then melee players get frustrated, especially when they're trying to compete in higher Mythic Plus dungeons. So how would you guys try to approach some of those concerns for this?
So when we're talking about things like roles, for instance, in dungeons, one of the things we often think about and discuss when we're talking about dungeon bosses in particular is we think of a dungeon as a whole the same way that we might think of an individual raid boss, right? So where on an individual raid boss, some of those concerns that you brought up, it would just, what's my answer? Like, what if I'm not so great on this fight? Well, the answer there is not as fun as it might be in a dungeon where you can just say, yeah, well, don't worry, the next boss, that's where you get to shine. So when we talk about dungeon bosses in particular, we always try to think of it as like, okay, this is a really tank heavy, like a tank mechanic heavy boss, right? This is one where the tank and the healer are gonna carry us through this. It might not have as much for a DPS in particular, but then maybe the boss right after that will, right? As long as we hit all those beats, and sometimes it's even good to have those peaks and valleys for an individual where it's like, okay, that boss is really hard for me. Okay, cool, this next boss, Scott and Ken are gonna carry me because they're the DPS and they're gonna be killing all the ads, and it's not as difficult for me. So that's usually how we think of a dungeon versus a raid in particular.
So what's the healer doing on this fight? We didn't really talk about it. I mean, as the tank, I can kind of see a situation where maybe you want to move the boss a bit, or maybe you can kind of, players always discover things like, let's tank the boss against the wall, because it eliminates 180 degrees of where those ads can spawn, unless you guys predetermine the ads to spawn somewhere in the room. So I can see some tank mobility going on. It'll crush the tank. It's this big behemoth water guy. DPS obviously important. They want to get those water images down, make sure that there's not too much damage. But what's the healer doing the whole time outside of healing the tank? It seems like we haven't really decided. I mean, is there going to be some kind of damage on the raid, some kind of dot going on, or is the healer just going to be spamming Wrath for minor amounts of damage in the meantime?
It's very likely that there's going to be some sort of party damage going on, whether that comes in the form of he randomly targets a person and water bolts them or something. This is kind of like the thing we talked about where whatever he's spamming the party with after the transition, it turns into shadow from water. So could be easy as a random targeted water bolt, or it could be just like he slams the ground, water hits everyone.
Okay. There's also that whole shadow side of it. We never really nailed down something that we were super happy about, but I think that's still a strong theme here. And often shadow has to do a lot with healing, like whether it be healing reduction effects or healing absorb effects, or even just something as simple as like a dot, right? You could say that dot is really weak at the beginning of the fight, or it's not super damaging at the beginning of the fight, but then as he gets more and more powerful, maybe it hits more targets. So by the end of the fight, your healer's just like, oh my god, whack-a-mole. So that's things like that. I think are still things that, like Candice mentioned, when we get to the like one paragraph version of this boss, that's a thing we'll dive a lot deeper on.
Okay. So I guess kind of in that same vein, there's always a concern of, I mean, there's such a wide range of mobility between the different classes and roles themselves. And with this kind of wave mechanic of getting pushed back, right? You know, some classes will just have an advantage, bring a Guardian Druid that can roar through them, Hunters disengage with them, Mages blink, et cetera, whereas the poor DK priests in the background are slowly drowning and getting pushed away. See you guys later. But so where do you, I mean, you'll never be able to design a fight that satisfies everything. It's just impossible. But where do you guys, especially for a first dungeon boss, where do you kind of draw the line on what's okay? Like, what is too much that we're really making those low mobility classes suffer a bit too much here? Or we're letting, you know, things like Guardian Druids, whatever, shine a bit too much maybe? Like, where do you draw that line for these kind of encounters?
I think for dungeons, it's just a question of, is it mandatory or not? Like, is it a bonus that I can run and that I don't have to hit my W button to stay going forward as much? Or is it just guaranteed gonna throw me off the ledge if I don't have a run speed buff? Like, obviously, that's just kind of like a tuning knob where you decide whether or not, you know, moving is a bonus or if it's necessary.
Yeah, we're always looking for ways to make it feel like really good about having a specific class with you, especially with mechanics. But not only that, like with the dungeon, we have all kinds of opportunities to fit that kind of thing in. You know, like with Court of Stars was a dungeon that we were experimenting with a lot in terms of like how much class and profession and different mechanics can we put in to make people feel really cool about what they can bring to the fight. So that's always a place where we're looking to have opportunities there. Like Candice said, with the dungeon, I don't think we would ever consider it like mandatory that a thing is there. It would just be like, cool, if you have this, you can skip this ads phase, or if you have this, you can, you know, CC those ads until we kill the boss, and that saves us a little bit of efficiency.
Cool. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned Court of Stars, just kind of, not really off topic because it's related to dungeons, but was that kind of model or experiment, was that successful in your guys' mind? Is that the kind of thing you might want to explore going forward? Because it certainly added a pretty cool, you know, unique flavor on a dungeon that we usually don't see. Because dungeons in a lot of players' heads are, well, you start, there's trash, you kill a boss, there's trash, you kill a boss. So it's cool to see this kind of twist. Do you guys, is that something you might work on in the future and try to have some different mechanics of the dungeons themselves?
I thought Court of Stars was very successful, and it's a really fun dungeon, and we use it as a reference for dungeons we're talking about in Battle for Azeroth, of like, how can we incorporate those kind of things? Obviously, we have to consider like Mythic Plus runs and what happens to the group where no one knows what's going on, and are they able to be successful still? But I think it was good.
Cool. So I guess more in your territory than Johnny. In terms of lore and aesthetics, some players don't care. I care though. I like going in a room and feeling like I'm in this shadow-corrupted water ledge and things are really dangerous. So how important is it for you guys to kind of develop these environments, you know, really well for the players to go in and be like, wow, I mean, we've just done a ton of Antorus testing now for the BTR, just kind of as an example leading into this. And going on Agrimar's platform was just mind-blowing. Or going upstairs to Argus was like, oh, this just looks awesome. I don't even care if the fight's like really bad. This is just great, you know? Not that the fight is bad, I'm just saying. How much attention do you guys pay to these kind of environments so the players really feel? I mean, this is a role-playing game at the end of the day. Players really want to feel like they're invested in the environment and that it's cool in a creepy environment, whatever it may be. So in this case, it would have to be this kind of, ledge with water and wind, and you feel really unstable. So how much do you guys pay attention to that?
We actually pay an immense amount of attention to that, but both in our dungeons and in the outdoor world too, right? It really takes the entire development team to really sell that fantasy, right? Like you mentioned, we're a role-playing game, and we've been talking a lot recently as we're developing Battle for Azeroth about how do we make sure that we're always capturing that fantasy, that I am playing this class and I'm in this world, and this world is a real place and feels real, and it has its own problems and things I care about, right? So it kind of varies on the specific situation, but it can be as simple as the dungeon artist that made Agrimar's room made it just super incredible, right? Or the character artist that made this boss here just made the shinticles so incredibly intricate and they wrap around so interestingly that you can't look away from it, right? But it's something that we think about a lot. And for all those people out there that don't read quest text, or they're not caring what the story is necessarily, it's just not their thing, that's completely cool, because our job as storytellers at the end of the day is that you cannot help but understand what's going on. The goal is that if you're listening to music and talking to your friends and all those wonderful things that we do while we're enjoying games and playing World of Warcraft, you can't help but notice what's going on. You can't help but be like, man, that room was really cool. What was that guy again? Who is that? Who's Agrimar? And then you go on the best 6-hour journey of your life figuring out all the answers to that. So hopefully,
Six is hopeful.
you can't help but absorb what's going on. Like there's like some ocean stuff happening, and I'm pretty sure that those dudes like betrayed those other dudes. What was that all about? And that's totally enough for us.
Cool. So this is we probably need to draw the brainstorm to an end. I really appreciate all of you doing this. I know that we would normally have a lot of meetings, and you do this over many, many hours to decide what the mechanics are. And certainly we haven't had to do this in front of a large crowd, so that's awesome, because they really did not rehearse this boss at all, so these ideas were raw. But thank you so much. I'm curious though, I think everyone wants to know, what happens next? Once you figure this out, what's the next step?
Yeah, so we usually have a couple of these meetings where we talk about individual bosses or dungeon bosses and mechanics like this. At that point, we then hand it off to Ken, who will go work on what we call a paper design, which is where he really just takes, anywhere from a couple of hours to a couple of days to just work out all the details about what this boss is going to be doing, what each role is going to do, what all the mechanics are. At that point, he sends out an email to the team, and we send feedback back. We iterate on that quite a bit up until the point where you're ready to start implementing and putting it in the game, and then we can play test it and get it into our community's hands and go from there.
Very cool. So we're gonna bring this to an end. Some of us are gonna hang out over by the arch there at Darkmoon Fair if you want to ask questions or have some comments. With any luck, everything we talked about tonight will be in that dungeon boss exactly as we described it, with no changes. But there might be a few changes, but you can be rest assured that you helped us put together a cool boss tonight. So thank you.